In addition to the outliner, there are many other ways to view and organize your scenes in Maya. Probably the most important one of these is called the hypergraph. So let's take a look at it. We can find the hypergraph under Windows, General Editors, and you'll see there's two entries here. One is called Hypergraph Hierarchy. The other one is called Hypergraph Connections. We're going to start with Hypergraph Hierarchy because that simulates the functionality of the outliner. Now, when we select Hypergraph Hierarchy, notice how we get all of these different nodes. Now, this window here is what's called a floating viewport. So you can navigate this like any other viewport. If you roll your middle mouse button, you can zoom in. You can hold down Alt or Opt and middle click to drag or right click to truck. Now, the one thing that you can't do is orbit by left clicking, and that's because this is a 2D viewport. Now, if you notice inside this, we have one node per object in the scene. And it's very similar to the outliner. So if I were to select, say, the stereo console here, it will select the object pretty much the way that it selects it in the outliner. Now, if I wanted to, I could dig down into that. I could select, say, the receiver only or the turntable or whatever. Now, I can also do that for any other object in the scene. So if I could select the TV stand base or just the TV set by clicking on the node. Now, the nice thing about the hypergraph is that it actually visually displays the hierarchy of the scene. You can see that each object is connected, and you can also see how the levels of that connectivity work. Now, when you have a scene that has a lot of objects, you may want to zoom in and isolate parts of the scene. So Maya has a couple of buttons here that help us. So if I were to say select the turntable here in stereo console, so if I select turntable base, I could frame that selection by pressing this button here, and that selects only the node. Or I could select the hierarchy below that. So if I frame just that hierarchy, it selects everything that's connected to that object. Or if I do frame branch, it frames only those things below it. So again, I can frame everything, just my node, anything connected to my node, or anything below my particular node. And regardless of how you frame it, you can, again, use your navigation tools to move in and out. Now, by default, the hypergraph organizes this according to the same organization that we have in the outliner. So if I go into, say, Windows Outliner, notice how I've got my TV stand here at the top, then the console, then the fireplace, and then my chairs and my tables. And that organization is in the same order as the outliner. Now, there are times when we want to change this, where we want to organize this maybe a little bit more visually. So we have this button here, which allows me to switch between freeform and automatic. Right now it's on automatic, but if I click this and notice how the boxes change, it becomes a freeform mode. So I can select, say, these objects here and move them into their own little area, or I can select, say, my spotlights and organize those how I want. And this is a great way to organize your nodes visually. You see this a lot in character animation where you may want to arrange your nodes to look kind of like the character. Now, once we've arranged these, we still have not lost the original outliner organization. So if I toggle this off, you'll see it goes back to that original default layout, and I can toggle between visual or organized according to the outliner. Now, there is one more way to look at the hypergraph. Right now, we're doing what's called hypergraph hierarchy, which shows the hierarchy of the scene. If I were to say select the TV set, I can actually click on this button here, which goes into hypergraph connections. Now, we can get to this directly by going into Windows, General Editors, Hypergraph Connections. That brings up that same window here. So we can toggle between it by going into Scene Hierarchy or Scene Connections, or we can get it directly from the menu system. Now, however we get into connections, you'll see that this looks a little bit different. Now, this is actually the connections of the nodes that make up the objects. And this is kind of actually works along with the attribute editor. So if I bring up my attribute editor here, you'll see that right now I have my TV set node, but if I click on this, this will bring up my different nodes for that object. So for example, the plastic of that TV set is a shader. We also have the screen, a gray color, as well as a rubber color. We can also select just the shape node, or we can select everything by selecting this node. So this is just another way to dig deeper into the objects in the scene. So go ahead and get used to using the hypergraph. It's a great visual way of viewing the objects in your scene.